Good evening and welcome back to the archive. The great oak doors have swung shut behind the last of the day's visitors, their brass hinges sighing with the weight of centuries. The marble halls stretch before us now in comfortable silence, illuminated only by the warm glow of gas lamps that have burned here since before your grandfather's time. The air carries that particular fragrance of aged leather and yellowed paper, the perfume of human memory, carefully preserved. I am your chief archivist, and tonight I've selected something particularly fascinating from our collection. A folio bound in midnight blue Morocco leather, its gold leaf lettering barely legible after decades of careful handling. The classification reads simply, The Fanatical Mania of End Times Prophets. Before we begin our quiet examination of these specimens, I should mention, if you find a certain peace in these nocturnal wanderings through humanity's more curious chapters, you're welcome to subscribe to our archive. It ensures you'll receive word when new exhibits are prepared for our, shall we say, more contemplative members. Now then, few things I've observed in my years among these stacks stir the human heart quite like the prospect of ending. Not personal ending, we're rather good at avoiding that particular thought, but the grand finale, the final curtain, the last page of the book of everything. The specimens before us tonight span centuries and continents, yet they share a peculiar consistency. Men and women, often quite intelligent, occasionally brilliant, who became absolutely certain that they alone possessed the secret knowledge of when and how the world would end. More remarkable, still their ability to convince others to abandon reason, sell their possessions, and gather in fields to wait for the sky to crack open like an overripe fruit. What were they thinking, we might wonder. And perhaps more intriguingly, what were their followers thinking? Let us examine the evidence, beginning with our first case file. Case File 1, The Grand Delusion, the Millerites, and the Great Disappointment of 1844. In the northeastern wing of our archive, filed under M for millennialism, we find the extensive documentation of one William Miller Farmer, war veteran and eventual prophet of the American frontier. The folder is thick, stuffed with newspaper clippings, personal letters, and testimonies that paint a portrait of perhaps history's most systematic attempt to calculate the end of everything. Miller was not your typical wild-eyed preacher. Born in 1782 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, he possessed what his contemporaries described as a methodical mind, the sort of man who could look at a field and tell you precisely how many bushels it would yield come harvest. After serving as a captain in the War of 1812, he returned to his farm in Lowhampton, New York, with what appeared to be an unshakable faith in the power of careful calculation. It was sometime around 1816 that Miller began his great work, a systematic study of biblical prophecy with the precision of an accountant balancing ledgers. He pored over the book of Daniel, cross-referenced it with Revelation, applied mathematical formulas with the confidence of a man surveying property lines. His method was simple. If the Bible was the Word of God, and God did not lie, then the prophecies could be decoded like any other puzzle. One simply needed the right key. Miller's key was something called the day-year principle, the notion that each prophetic day represented an actual year. Using this method, he traced through Daniel's prophecy of 2,300 days until the sanctuary would be cleansed, which he interpreted as Christ's return to purify the earth. His calculations, meticulously recorded in margins and notebooks that survive to this day, pointed to a specific range, sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. Now, one might assume that such a specific and dramatic prediction would be met with skepticism, particularly in the rational atmosphere of 1830s New England. One would be quite wrong. Miller's message spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. He was invited to speak at churches, camp meetings, and revival gatherings throughout New England and beyond. His careful charts and calculations impressed audiences who had grown weary of vague spiritual platitudes. Here was a man offering concrete answers to the ultimate question. Not merely, will the world end? But when, precisely, will it end? A movement that coalesced around Miller's prophecy came to be known as Millerism, though Miller himself preferred to think of it as simply Bible study. By 1843, the movement claimed between 50,000 and 100,000 adherents, a remarkable number in a nation of just 17 million souls. What's particularly fascinating, from our perspective here in the archive, is how rational people responded to Miller's calculations. Consider the case of Henry Dana Ward, editor of a religious newspaper, who initially dismissed Miller as a fanatic. After attending one of Miller's lectures and examining his mathematical proofs, Ward became so convinced that he began publishing Miller's calculations in his own paper. The evidence, Ward wrote, is as clear as the rising sun. Or take Nathaniel Southard, a successful merchant from Boston, who liquidated his entire business in early 1843. His reasoning, preserved in a letter to his brother, was impeccable. If Christ returns in March, earthly wealth will be meaningless. If he does not, I have made a terrible error. But given the mathematical certainty of Miller's calculations, the first scenario is infinitely more probable. As 1843 progressed, Millerite communities began preparing for the end with the thoroughness of people packing for a long journey. Farmers left crops unharvested. Why plant seed for a harvest that would never come? Craftsmen abandoned half-finished projects. Children were kept home from school to spend their remaining days in prayer and preparation. The movement developed its own newspapers, its own hymns, its own peculiar economy. Millerite publications like The Midnight Cry and Signs of the Times circulated detailed timetables and instructions for preparation. Artists created elaborate charts mapping out the prophetic timeline, colorful diagrams that resembled nothing so much as railroad schedules for the Second Coming. But March 21st, 1844 came and went. The sun rose as it had for billions of years prior. Birds sang, children played. The world continued its ancient rotation with maddening normalcy. Miller himself was devastated, but not deterred. Mistakes had been made. He announced errors in calculation. The date was revised to April 18, 1844. When April passed quietly, another Millerite leader, Samuel Snow, recalculated using the Jewish calendar and arrived at October 22, 1844. This, Snow declared with renewed certainty, would be the actual, final, absolutely certain date of Christ's return. The period leading up to October 22, 1844, represents perhaps the most concentrated display of apocalyptic fervor in American history. Millerites gathered in groups across New England and the burned-over district of New York, dressed in white ascension robes, a detail that survives in newspaper accounts, though Miller himself discouraged such theatrical preparations. Many climbed hills and mountains, reasoning that they might as well meet their ascending Savior halfway. Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire became a particular gathering point, its summit dotted with small camps of believers spending their final earthly nights in prayer and hymns. Lucy Hersey, a young woman from Massachusetts, left a particularly detailed account of those final hours. She described the mixture of terror and ecstasy that gripped her community as October 22nd dawned. "We were so certain," she wrote years later, "that we examined our hearts for any last traces of worldly attachment. I threw away a small mirror I had carried since childhood, reasoning that vanity would have no place in the kingdom to come." As the day progressed and the appointed hour approached, Snow had calculated Christ's return for 6 p.m. Millerite communities fell into hushed anticipation. Some accounts describe believers literally holding their breath, expecting at any moment to feel their feet leave the ground. 6 o'clock passed, then 7, then 8. The harvest moon rose full and bright over New England, illuminating the upturned faces of thousands who had been so certain they would not see another earthly sunrise. What followed came to be known with devastating accuracy as the Great Disappointment. The term was coined by the Millerites themselves, and it captures something profound about the particular quality of their despair. This was not merely the disappointment of missing a train or losing a bet. This was the collapse of entire worldview, the failure of what had seemed like mathematical certainty. Hiram Edson, a prominent Millerite from New York, described the morning of October 23rd in terms that still echo across the decades. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have been no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned. Some Millerites never recovered from the great disappointment. They returned to their abandoned farms and businesses to find crops rotted, creditors angry, and neighbors skeptical. Children who had been kept from school found themselves behind in their studies. Merchants who had liquidated their stock faced financial ruin. Others, remarkably, found ways to preserve their faith. They developed new interpretations. Perhaps Christ had returned, but to a heavenly sanctuary invisible to earthly eyes. Perhaps the date was correct, but the event misunderstood. A remnant of believers eventually coalesced into what would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which today claims over 20 million members worldwide. But for our purposes here in the archive, the Millerites represent something more than a failed prophecy. They demonstrate the extraordinary power of certainty, how mathematical precision can transform speculation into conviction, and conviction into mass movement. William Miller was not a charlatan or a madman. He was a careful, methodical man who made a careful, methodical error and convinced thousands of others to stake everything on his calculations. The documents in our file suggest that Miller himself never fully recovered from the great disappointment. He spent his remaining years, he died in 1849, quietly revising his calculations, never quite admitting error, but never again setting a specific date. In his final letters, preserved here among our specimens, there's a tone of bewilderment that's almost heartbreaking. I was so certain. He wrote to a friend in 1848, the mathematics seemed so clear. Perhaps that's the most human element of this particular folly. Not the grand delusion itself, but the quiet confusion that followed. In our archive of human mistakes, few things are more poignant than certainty proven wrong, than mathematics that failed to add up to the end of everything. But let us now move to a different wing of our collection, where the specimens take a more personal form. Case File 2, Joanna Southcott and the Unborn Messiah in a Box. In the quieter alcove of our archive, behind glass cases that require special permission to access, we house the more intimate specimens of human folly. These are not the grand delusions that sweep nations, but the personal obsessions that consume individual lives and, through sheer force of conviction, convince others to share in their particular madness. Here, filed under S for Southcott, we find one of our most peculiar exhibits, a leather-bound portfolio containing the complete documentation of Joanna Southcott, a Devon farmer's daughter who, at the age of 42, became convinced she was destined to bear the new Messiah. The story that unfolds in these yellowed pages represents perhaps the most intimate apocalyptic delusion in our collection. Joanna Southcott was born in 1750 in Gittisham, Devon, into circumstances so unremarkable that they seem almost carefully designed to highlight the extraordinary transformation that followed. The daughter of a small farmer, she spent her early years as a domestic servant, then as a shopkeeper's assistant, a woman who might have lived and died in complete obscurity, if not for the peculiar visions that began visiting her in 1792. The first signs of what would become Southcott's grand delusion appeared as voices, not the dramatic, thunderous pronouncements one might expect from divine revelation, but quiet, conversational communications that she initially mistook for her own thoughts. She began keeping a diary of these spiritual conversations, writing in a rapid, almost automatic hand that created documents our handwriting experts have studied with considerable fascination. What makes Southcott's case particularly intriguing is how methodically she documented her own descent into prophetic certainty. Her early diary entries, preserved here in our collection, show a woman struggling with doubt. Can this voice truly be the Lord's? She wrote in March 1793, or am I simply a foolish woman talking to herself? But as months passed, doubt gave way to conviction, and conviction hardened into unshakable certainty. By 1801, Southcott had begun her public ministry, and what a ministry it was. Unlike Miller's mathematical approach to prophecy, Southcott's method was intensely personal, almost intimate. She claimed to be in constant communication with the Spirit of Christ, receiving detailed instructions about everything from contemporary politics to the proper way to prepare mutton stew. Her followers, who came to call themselves Southcottians, were drawn not to charts and calculations, but to the extraordinary specificity of her prophecies. She predicted Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, though she hedged her bet by making the prediction after reports of the battle had reached London. She foretold good harvests and bad, the deaths of prominent figures, and the outcomes of local elections. When she was right, her followers marveled at her divine connection. When she was wrong, they found creative ways to reinterpret her words. But it was in 1813, at the age of 63, that Southcott made the announcement that would define her legacy and create one of the most bizarre episodes in the annals of apocalyptic fervor. She declared herself pregnant with the second Messiah. Now, from our vantage point here in the archive, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of human folly, this announcement might seem like simple madness. But the documentation in our files reveals something far more complex. Southcott didn't simply claim to be pregnant. She exhibited what appeared to be genuine physical symptoms. Her abdomen swelled. She experienced morning sickness. She reported feeling the movement of the child within her. Dr. Richard Rees, a respected London physician whose detailed medical notes survive in our collection, examined Southcott multiple times during her supposed pregnancy. His reports, written in the precise medical language of the early 19th century, describe physical changes that seem to support her claim. The patient exhibits all the classic signs of advanced pregnancy. He wrote in September 1814, the enlargement of the abdomen, the cessation of monthly courses, the sensitivity of the breasts, all are consistent with a woman carrying child. What Dr. Rees and other medical observers failed to account for was the extraordinary power of psychological conviction to manifest physical symptoms. Modern medicine has a term for this phenomenon, pseudocyesis, or false pregnancy, but in 1814, the medical understanding of the mind's influence on the body was rudimentary at best. Southcott, meanwhile, was making increasingly elaborate preparations for the birth of the new Messiah. She commissioned a special cradle, carved from the finest English oak and inlaid with mother of pearl. She gathered a collection of baby clothes sewn from the most expensive silks her followers could afford. Most remarkably, she ordered the construction of a special box, a sealed container that would, she declared, hold items essential for the Messiah's mission on earth. This box, which survives to this day and has become known as Joanna Southcott's box, represents one of the most tangible artifacts of apocalyptic delusion in existence. Made of oak and bound with iron, it measures roughly 2 feet by 1 foot by 1 foot. Southcott claimed to have placed within it a collection of prophetic writings, sacred objects, and instructions that would only be opened when 24 Anglican bishops agreed to examine its contents in the presence of one Anglican clergyman. The specificity of these requirements reveals the particular genius of Southcott's delusion. By making the opening of the box dependent on the unanimous agreement of Anglican bishops' men not known for their tendency toward unanimous agreement on anything, she virtually guaranteed that her secrets would remain sealed indefinitely. As 1814 progressed and Southcott's pregnancy advanced, excitement among her followers reached fever pitch. They gathered in increasing numbers around her house in London's Paddington district, camping in the streets and conducting constant prayer vigils. Newspapers across England reported on the phenomenon with a mixture of mockery and genuine curiosity. Even skeptics found themselves wondering, what if she was right? The Southcottians established a birth fund, collecting money to support the Messiah and his mother during the crucial early years. They wrote hymns celebrating the coming birth and composed elaborate prayers for the safe delivery of humanity's Savior. Some sold their possessions and traveled hundreds of miles to be present for the miraculous event. But as autumn turned to winter, and winter deepened toward the darkest days of December, something began to go wrong with Southcott's carefully constructed prophecy. The physical symptoms of pregnancy, which had seemed so convincing to Dr. Rees and others, began to change in troubling ways. Southcott complained of severe pain, difficulty breathing, and a strange hardening of her abdomen that seemed inconsistent with impending childbirth. On December 17, 1814, Southcott called her closest followers to her bedside. The Messiah's birth, she announced, would be delayed. The child was not yet ready to enter the world, she explained, and would remain in her womb until the proper celestial conditions aligned. Her followers accepted this explanation with the same faith they had shown throughout her pregnancy. 10 days later, on December 27, 1814, Joanna Southcott died. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Rees and several other physicians, revealed no trace of pregnancy, false or otherwise. Southcott's enlarged abdomen was found to contain a large tumor, which had gradually grown throughout 1814, creating the physical symptoms she and others had interpreted as pregnancy. The movements she had felt and reported were likely the tumor pressing against her internal organs. But here's where our story takes perhaps its most poignant turn. Rather than abandon their faith in the face of medical evidence, many Southcottians developed an alternative interpretation of events. Southcott, they declared, had indeed been carrying the Messiah, but the child had been taken up into heaven before birth, sparing the world the trauma of the end times until humanity was better prepared for salvation. The box remained sealed, as Southcott had intended. Her followers formed a society dedicated to preserving it and finding the 24 bishops necessary for its opening. The Panacea Society, as they came to call themselves, would guard Southcott's box for more than 2 centuries, convinced that its opening would herald the beginning of the end times. What fascinates me, as I examine these documents by lamplight, is not the delusion itself. History is full of people who believed themselves chosen by God for special purposes. What's remarkable is the intimate nature of Southcott's prophecy and the way it transformed her physical being to match her spiritual conviction. Unlike Miller's mathematical certainty or the grand public spectacles we'll examine in our remaining case files, Southcott's delusion was profoundly personal. She didn't calculate the end of the world. She claimed to be carrying it in her womb. She didn't gather followers in fields to wait for Christ's return. She invited them to witness his birth in her bedroom. The medical records in our file suggest that Southcott genuinely experienced the physical symptoms she reported. Her enlarged abdomen, her morning sickness, her maternal behavior, these weren't conscious deceptions, but the physical manifestation of profound psychological conviction. In some sense, Joanna Southcott truly was pregnant, not with a child, but with an idea so powerful it reshaped her body to accommodate it. Her followers' response is equally telling. In an age when medical knowledge was limited and divine intervention seemed more plausible than it does today, Southcott's pregnancy appeared entirely credible to people who wanted to believe. Dr. Rees, a trained physician, was convinced by what he saw and felt during his examinations. The physical evidence seemed to support her claims. Yet even after the autopsy revealed the truth, many followers found ways to preserve their faith. This suggests something profound about the human need for meaning, for the sense that we are living through times of special significance. Southcott offered her followers the ultimate significance. They weren't just living through history. they were witnessing the birth of its completion. In the end, Joanna Southcott's story represents perhaps the most intimate form of apocalyptic delusion. The belief that the end of everything could be contained within a single human body, that the salvation of the world could emerge from one woman's womb. It's a delusion both grand and deeply personal, cosmic in scope, yet as intimate as childbirth itself. Her sealed box remains intact even today, still waiting for its 24 bishops, still holding whatever secrets a Devon farmer's daughter thought necessary for the end of the world. In our archive of human folly, few specimens capture quite so perfectly the meeting point between personal delusion and cosmic ambition. But let us now move to a more recent wing of our collection, where the specimens involve not divine revelation, but technological anxiety, and where the approaching apocalypse was measured not in biblical prophecies, but in lines of computer code. Case File 3, the 1999 Y2K Panic. Our journey through the archive now brings us to its newest wing, a section that still smells faintly of fresh paint and modern preservation chemicals. Here we house the more recent specimens of human folly, including our extensive collection on what may be history's first truly global technological panic. The I2K files occupy an entire wall of filing cabinets, stuffed with government reports, corporate memos, newspaper clippings, and thousands of pages of testimony from the great computer anxiety of 1999. Unlike our previous specimens, which emerged from religious fervor or personal delusion, this particular folly was born from something far more mundane: lazy programming and an almost touching faith in exponential technological growth. To understand the I2K panic, or the Millennium Bug, as it came to be known, we must first examine the curious technical decision that made it possible. In the early days of computing, when memory was measured in kilobytes rather than gigabytes, programmers developed a habit of representing years with just 2 digits. 1965 became 65, 1978 became 78, and so forth. It was a simple efficiency measure. Why waste precious memory storing 19 when everyone knew what century they were living in? This programming shortcut, repeated thousands of times across decades of software development, created what computer scientists would later recognize as a legacy problem. A decision made for perfectly rational reasons that becomes increasingly problematic as time passes. By the 1990s, this 2-digit date format was embedded in everything from bank systems to nuclear power plant controls, from elevator software to traffic management systems. The first warnings about the year 2000 problem appeared as early as the 1980s, buried in technical journals and software engineering conferences. These early warnings were remarkably prescient, and, in retrospect, quite measured in their concerns. Bob Beamer, often credited as one of the first to identify the problem, wrote in a 1979 article that systems would need to be updated well before the millennium to avoid minor inconveniences and major disasters. Note that phrase, minor inconveniences and major disasters. It captures perfectly the genuine uncertainty that surrounded Y2K. The problem was real computers programmed to interpret 00 as 1900 rather than 2000 could indeed malfunction. But the scope and severity of these malfunctions remained largely unknowable until the moment they occurred. By the mid-1990s, as the year 2000 approached with mechanical inevitability, the computing industry began to take the problem seriously. Companies started conducting Y2K audits, examining millions of lines of code for date-related vulnerabilities. Governments formed Y2K task forces. International organizations issued warnings and recommendations. And somewhere in this entirely reasonable process of technological housekeeping, something peculiar happened. The Y2K problem stopped being a technical challenge and became an apocalyptic scenario. Consider this headline from the London Times in March 1999. Doomsday bug will crash the world. Or this warning from a Y2K preparedness book that sold hundreds of thousands of copies. When the power grids fail and the food distribution system collapses, only those who have prepared will survive the chaos that follows. How did we get from minor inconveniences and major disasters to only those who have prepared will survive? The answer lies in a fascinating convergence of technological anxiety, media amplification, and the eternal human tendency to prepare for the worst possible scenario. The I2K consulting industry, which barely existed in 1995, had grown to a multi-billion-dollar sector by 1999. Companies like Capgemini and IBM established entire Y2K remediation divisions. Consultants traveled from business to business, conducting Y2K readiness assessments that invariably concluded that extensive and expensive remediation work was necessary. Now, to be entirely fair from our perspective here in the archive, much of this work was genuinely necessary. Banks did need to update their systems. Airlines did need to ensure their reservation computers wouldn't crash. The technical challenge was real and substantial, but the consulting industry had a powerful incentive to emphasize the catastrophic potential of Y2K failures. A consultant who suggested that most Y2K problems would likely be minor inconveniences was unlikely to be hired for expensive remediation projects. A consultant who painted vivid pictures of airplanes falling from the sky and bank systems crashing was much more likely to secure lucrative contracts. The numbers are staggering. The U.S. government alone spent an estimated $100 billion on Y2K preparations. Worldwide, the figure approached $600 billion, roughly equivalent to the entire GDP of modern-day Switzerland, spent on preventing a problem that might or might not cause serious disruptions. But Y2K anxiety extended far beyond corporate boardrooms and government agencies. By 1999, a substantial survivalist movement had emerged around the millennium bug. Y2K preppers stockpiled food, water, generators, and weapons in preparation for the social collapse they were certain would follow the failure of computer systems. Gary North, a prominent Y2K survivalist whose newsletter reached tens of thousands of subscribers, recommended storing at least 1 year's worth of food and supplies. His Y2K survival checklist, preserved here in our files, includes 50-pound bags of rice, cases of canned goods, water purification tablets, shortwave radios, and ammunition for protection during the transitional period. North's reasoning was impeccably logical, given his assumptions. If computer failures caused power grids to collapse, food distribution systems would fail. If food became scarce, social order would break down. If social order broke down, those who had prepared would need to defend their supplies from those who hadn't. The flaw in this reasoning wasn't logical, but empirical North had no way of knowing how extensive Y2K failures would actually be, so he prepared for the worst-case scenario. And once you've invested thousands of dollars in survival supplies, psychological consistency demands that you continue believing in the scenario that justifies that investment. The media, meanwhile, found Y2K irresistible as a story. It combined technological complexity that sounded mysterious and threatening to non-technical audiences, a specific deadline that created natural dramatic tension, and the possibility of truly global consequences. News programs ran countdown clocks to January 1st, 2000. Documentaries explored Y2K survival strategies. Newspapers published checklists for Y2K preparedness that read like wartime rationing guides. Peter Jennings, in a December 1999 ABC News special, intoned gravely, "In just a few days, we will know whether our technological civilization can survive its own complexity." The language is remarkable, not, "We will know how serious the I2K problem is," but "We will know whether our civilization can survive." This escalation from technical problem to existential threat reveals something profound about how societies process technological anxiety. Y2K represented the first time in human history that a potential catastrophe was measured not in terms of natural disasters, wars, or economic collapse, but in terms of software failure. The idea that civilization might end because programmers in the 1970s wanted to save memory space had an almost surreal quality that seemed to demand extreme responses. As December 31st, 1999 approached, the world held its collective breath. Emergency response centers were staffed around the clock. Military units were placed on high alert. Hospitals stockpiled supplies. Some people attended millennium parties. Others huddled in bunkers with their survival supplies. The first test came as midnight approached in New Zealand and Australia, the first major industrialized nations to cross into the year 2000. Television cameras focused on power plants and city skylines, waiting for the lights to go out. Computer screens displayed system monitors, ready to capture the moment when civilization's digital backbone collapsed. And nothing happened. Well, almost nothing. A few slot machines in Delaware casinos stopped working. Some Japanese nuclear power plants experienced minor monitoring glitches that were quickly corrected. A handful of weather monitoring stations temporarily stopped transmitting data. The U.S. Defense Department reported that a spy satellite stopped processing information for a few hours before automatically resetting itself. As midnight traveled westward across the globe, the pattern repeated. Minor glitches, quickly fixed. Inconveniences rather than catastrophes. By the time January 1st, 2000 dawned in California, it was clear that the great Y2K disaster was not going to materialize. The immediate response was a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Gary North, the Case File 4, the Hindsight File, the Year 1000 Panic in Europe. We arrive now at the most venerable section of our archive, where the specimens are so old that they seem to exhale the breath of centuries past. Here, in climate-controlled cases behind thick glass, we preserve documents that predate the printing press-illuminated manuscripts, monastic chronicles, and papal bulls written on vellum by candlelight in scriptoriums that have long since crumbled to dust. But tonight's final exhibit presents us with a peculiar challenge. Unlike our previous case files, where we have examined well-documented delusions with clear historical records, this specimen deals with something far more elusive, a panic that may never have existed at all. The file before us, bound in cracked leather that bears the unmistakable patina of extreme age, contains what purports to be evidence of widespread terror across medieval Europe as the year 1000 approached. According to this narrative, one that appeared in history books for centuries, peasants abandoned their fields, nobles donated their wealth to monasteries, and entire populations gathered in churches to await the end of the world as the first millennium of Christ's reign approached its close. It's a compelling story, rich with dramatic detail and medieval atmosphere. There's only one problem. Most of it appears to be false. The legend of the terror of the year 1000, or Terror's Annie-Meal, as medieval chroniclers might have called it, seems to have been largely invented by historians working centuries after the fact. It represents perhaps our most intriguing specimen, not a delusion experienced by historical actors, but a delusion experienced by the historians who studied them. To understand how this historical myth developed, we must first examine what we actually know about the approach of the year 1000 in medieval Europe. The evidence, scattered across monasteries and cathedral libraries from Ireland to Italy, paints a picture quite different from the apocalyptic panic that later historians would describe. Contemporary chronicles from the period, and we have preserved several dozen in our collection, make remarkably little mention of millennial anxiety. The Annals of Quedlinburg, written by a German chronicler, records the events of the year 1000 with mundane precision. In this year, Emperor Otto III held court at Rome. There was a good harvest. Bishop Willigus dedicated the new cathedral at Mainz. Not exactly the language of apocalyptic terror. Similarly, the Chronicle of Thietmar of Merseburg, one of our most detailed sources for the period, describes the year 1000 primarily in terms of political events and church affairs. He mentions Otto III's pilgrimage to the tomb of Charlemagne and various diplomatic negotiations. If the common people were cowering in churches awaiting the end of the world, Thietmer seems remarkably unaware of it. The Chronicle of Adhemar of Chabannes, written in southwestern France, does contain references to apocalyptic expectations, but these are connected not to the year 1000, but to specific events like famines, eclipses, and outbreaks of disease. Medieval people certainly believed in the approaching end of the world, but they looked for signs in earthly catastrophes rather than calendar dates. This raises an important question. If medieval chroniclers weren't particularly concerned about the year 1000, where did the legend of millennial panic originate? The answer appears to lie in the work of later historians, particularly those writing in the 16th and 17th centuries. Renaissance historians, looking back at the medieval period with a mixture of fascination and condescension, found the idea of millennial panic irresistibly dramatic. It fit perfectly with their view of the Middle Ages as a time of superstition and ignorance, when simple peasants lived in constant fear of supernatural catastrophe. Cardinal Caesar Baronius, writing in the late 16th century, was among the first to describe widespread terror surrounding the year 1000. His Ecclesiastical Annals, a massive 12-volume history of the Catholic Church, includes vivid descriptions of people abandoning their homes, donating their possessions to monasteries, and gathering in churches to await the second coming. But when modern scholars have attempted to trace Baronius's sources for these dramatic claims, they've found something curious. He cites virtually no contemporary evidence. His descriptions appear to be based on later medieval sources writing centuries after the fact, or on his own assumptions about what medieval people must have believed. The pattern repeats with other early modern historians. They found the idea of millennial panic so plausible, so consistent with their understanding of medieval mentality, that they felt comfortable describing it in detail despite having little contemporary evidence to support their claims. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the terror of the year 1000 had become accepted historical fact. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, describes the approach of the millennium in characteristically dramatic terms. A panic terror, a forerunner of the end of the world, seized on the minds of men. Gibbon cites no sources for this claim by his time. Millennial panic had become such accepted wisdom that it required no documentation. The legend reached its full flowering in 19th century Romantic historiography, where medieval panic fitted perfectly with the Romantic fascination with emotion, superstition, and dramatic historical moments. Historians like Jules Michelet painted vivid pictures of terrified peasants and fanatical monks, creating what amounted to historical fiction presented as scholarly fact. Now, from our perspective here in the archive, this poses a fascinating question. How do we categorize this particular specimen of human folly? The medieval peasants who allegedly panicked as the year 1000 approached seem largely to have been figments of later historians' imaginations. But the historians who created and perpetuated this myth were real people making real intellectual errors. What we're examining, in essence, is a collective delusion shared by centuries of scholars. The persistent belief that medieval people must have been terrified by the approach of the year 1000, despite the lack of contemporary evidence for such terror. The creation of the year 1000 myth reveals several fascinating aspects of how historical narratives develop. First, there's the power of plausibility. The idea of millennial panic seemed so reasonable to later historians that they felt comfortable describing it without solid evidence. Medieval people were religious, the reasoning went, and religious people worry about apocalyptic prophecies, so they must have panicked as the year 1000 approached. Second, there's the tendency of each generation of historians to rely on the work of previous generations without carefully examining original sources. Once Baronius had described millennial panic, Later historians cited Baronius rather than returning to medieval chronicles. The myth became self-reinforcing. Third, there's the influence of contemporary concerns on historical interpretation. Renaissance and Enlightenment historians, living through their own periods of religious and social upheaval, projected their contemporary anxieties back onto the medieval past. The idea that calendar dates could trigger mass panic seemed plausible because they were living in an age when calendar-based prophecies were indeed causing social disruption. But what did medieval people actually believe about the end of the world? The evidence from our collection suggests a picture quite different from later historical myth. Medieval apocalyptic thought was indeed widespread and sophisticated, but it focused on signs and portents rather than specific dates. Medieval chroniclers looked for apocalyptic significance in natural disasters, political upheavals, and social changes. They calculated the age of the world not from Christ's birth, but from the creation, placing the year 1000 somewhere around the middle of world history, rather than at its end. Most importantly, medieval scholars were aware that the exact date of Christ's birth was uncertain, making any precise millennial calculation problematic. The few contemporary references to millennial expectations that do exist in our collection are notably restrained. Abbot Abbo of Fleury, writing around 1000, mentions that he had heard some preachers in Paris claiming the Antichrist would appear at the millennium, but he dismisses these claims as theologically unfounded. This is hardly the language of widespread panic. Similarly, the historian Raoul Glaber, writing about 30 years after 1000, describes various portents and disasters, but places them in the context of the approaching 1000th anniversary of Christ's Passion rather than his birth. Even then, Glaber's tone is more hopeful than terrified. He sees these events as signs of renewal rather than ending. So what are we to make of this curious case file? The terror of the year 1000 represents a different kind of human folly, not the delusion of historical actors, but the delusion of those who study them. It reveals how historical narratives can develop a life of their own, becoming accepted truth despite a lack of supporting evidence. In some ways, the creation of the year 1000 myth mirrors the other cases we've examined tonight. Like William Miller's biblical calculations, it involved intelligent people applying seemingly rigorous methods to reach dramatically wrong conclusions. Like Joanna Southcott's pregnancy, it involved the physical manifestation of psychological conviction. Historians so convinced of medieval panic that they could describe it in vivid detail. Like the Y2K hysteria, it involved the projection of contemporary anxieties onto complex systems poorly understood. But the year 1000 myth also reveals something unique: the capacity of historical narratives to persist across centuries even when they lack evidential support. Once the story of millennial panic became established in historical literature, it proved remarkably resistant to revision. Even today, popular histories and documentaries continue to describe the terror of the year 1000 as established historical fact. This persistence suggests something profound about human psychology. We seem drawn to stories of past panics and prophecies, perhaps because they confirm our sense that we live in more rational times. The idea that our ancestors were terrified by arbitrary calendar dates makes us feel sophisticated by comparison. Yet, as we've seen in our journey through the archive tonight, the human capacity for apocalyptic delusion has remained remarkably consistent across the centuries. The specific triggers change: biblical prophecy, personal revelation, technological failure, historical myth, but the underlying patterns persist. We continue to find ways to convince ourselves that we stand at the threshold of ending, that we possess special knowledge of coming catastrophe, that our moment in history is uniquely significant. Perhaps that's the most human folly of all, the persistent belief that this time, finally, we've got it right, that our calculations are more precise, our evidence more compelling, our preparations more adequate than those of our deluded predecessors. From our perspective here in the archive, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of human error across the millennia. Such confidence seems, well, delightfully optimistic. Reflection. And so we reach the end of our nocturnal journey through the archive, our examination of humanity's persistent fascination with endings complete. The specimens we've studied tonight: Miller's mathematical certainty, Southcott's intimate delusion, the Y2K technological panic, and the myth of medieval millennial terror span nearly 3 centuries and represent vastly different forms of apocalyptic thinking. Yet certain patterns emerge from these diverse case files, threads that weave through human consciousness across time and culture. There is, first, the extraordinary power of certainty in the face of uncertainty. William Miller's careful calculations provided the comforting illusion of mathematical precision about the unknowable. Y2K experts offer detailed technical predictions about systems too complex for complete analysis. Even the historians who created the year 1000 myth were certain they understood medieval mentality, despite lacking adequate evidence. This suggests something profound about human psychology. When faced with genuinely uncertain outcomes, we often prefer elaborate speculation to honest acknowledgement of ignorance. The alternative, admitting that we simply don't know when or how the world will end, seems somehow unsatisfying, even intolerable. Second, there is the remarkable consistency with which apocalyptic movements attract intelligent, thoughtful people. Miller was a careful student of Scripture. Southcott's followers included educated merchants and professionals. Y2K preparations were led by sophisticated computer scientists and engineers. These were not the actions of simple minds seeking simple answers, but of complex minds creating complex justifications for dramatic conclusions. This challenges the comfortable notion that apocalyptic thinking is primarily the province of the ignorant or desperate. The evidence suggests instead that the human capacity for self-deception is remarkably democratic, equally available to the educated and uneducated, the prosperous and struggling. Third, there is the curious way in which apocalyptic predictions survive their own failure. When the world fails to end as predicted, believers rarely abandon their fundamental assumptions. Instead, they revise their calculations, reinterpret their evidence, or find alternative explanations that preserve the core narrative. The great disappointment led not to the dissolution of Millerism, but to its transformation into Seventh-day Adventism. Y2K failure was reframed as Y2K success. Even the complete lack of evidence for year 1000 panic didn't prevent the story from persisting in popular imagination. This suggests that apocalyptic thinking serves psychological needs that extend beyond mere prediction. Perhaps we need to believe that our moment in history is uniquely significant, that we stand at the threshold of transformation, that the patterns of ordinary life are about to give way to something extraordinary. Finally, there is the question of whether these specimens represent pure folly or something more complex. Certainly, the specific predictions we've examined proved wrong. Miller's calculations failed. Southcote died undelivered. Y2K passed without catastrophe, and medieval panic appears to have been largely mythical. But each of these movements also demonstrated genuine human virtues carried to unfortunate extremes. Miller's careful biblical study reflected deep religious commitment. Southcott's followers showed touching faith in divine possibility. Y2K preparations revealed admirable caution in the face of technological uncertainty. Even the historians who created the year 1000 myth were attempting to understand and explain human behavior across vast spans of time. Perhaps that's the most profound lesson from our archive, that human folly and human wisdom are often separated by degree rather than kind. The same intellectual curiosity that drives scientific discovery can, under slightly different circumstances, lead to elaborate delusion. The same social cooperation that builds civilizations can, when directed toward apocalyptic preparation, result in mass disappointment. As I prepare to close the archive for another evening, I'm reminded that we who study these historical follies are not immune to our own forms of delusion. We tell ourselves that we are more rational than our predecessors, more skeptical of extraordinary claims, more resistant to apocalyptic thinking. Yet we live in an age of climate change predictions, technological singularity theories, and economic collapse scenarios. We have our own prophets of ending, our own detailed calculations of catastrophe. Perhaps the greatest folly would be to assume that we have somehow transcended the patterns documented in these files. The human heart, it seems, will always find new ways to convince itself that this time, finally, we stand at the end of everything. But for tonight, at least, the world continues its ancient rotation. The prophets sleep, their calculations temporarily set aside. The great questions of ending remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. And here in the archive, surrounded by the gentle folly of our ancestors, there is a strange sort of peace. The specimens we've examined tonight will be here tomorrow, and the day after, and for years to come, patient reminders of humanity's eternal fascination with endings, and equally eternal capacity to survive their own predictions of catastrophe. Rest well, knowing that the world has ended many times before, and somehow, mysteriously, continued. In the great archive of human experience, that may be the most remarkable folly of all. Our persistent ability to be wrong about endings, and our equally persistent ability to begin again. Sleep well.